On eymanage, funding for children is linked to the term type they're assigned. A child can have multiple terms per year, and funding can only be applied within term dates. You can change how funding functions on a nursery-wide or individual child basis by customizing funding settings. To see a list of your terms, go to System Settings, Terms/Funding. Click on this button in the top right to edit your funding settings. Here, you can fill in the maximum funded hours that can be assigned weekly for universal entitlement and extended entitlement, as well as the maximum funded hours per day. Individual funding assignments are edited in the child profile, which I'll get to later. The fields below depend on whether you have your invoice settings set to actuals invoices or equally spread. If you use equally spread invoices, there will be an additional field in which you can choose how the monthly funding reduction is calculated. As per weekly funding hours means funding will be calculated based on the sample week used in calculating equally spread invoices. As per average of academic year calculates funding based on the total funding allocation for the academic year split equally across the months. This is what the funding settings will look like if you use actuals invoices. In this field, you can choose how funding is allocated. As per sessions means that funding is allocated on a session-by-session basis at that session's hourly rate. As per funding rate means funding is allocated according to the hourly funding rate you assign to a term. If you select this option, you can also choose between applying this funding per term or as an average of all the terms in an academic year. Finally, you can allocate funding as an average of actual sessions, which means funding is allocated based on the total price of sessions for the week. At the bottom, there are a number of options that you may want to consider turning on, depending on your preferences. This option will make it so weekend sessions are eligible to be allocated funding. Checking this option will round up entitlement to the nearest whole number, meaning it will be counted in hours rather than hours and minutes. Turning on this option will give you the ability to mark a session as extra, which means it won't be eligible for funding. This option will apply the child's discount from their profile, if they have one, to the funding rate. And finally, checking this box will make it so funding can only be applied to invoices if Parent Declaration Form has been ticked during funding allocation in the term/funding settings or on the child's profile. When you're done, click Update Settings. To create a term, click on the plus icon in the top right. Give the term an identifiable name like Autumn Term 2024 and a description. Select which year this term is for, then choose which dates this term starts and ends. The funding eligible date field is the latest date a child can have their birthday to be eligible for funding for this term. In this field, you can select how the system will calculate funding entitlement in the case of partial weeks at the beginning or end of a month. Full week entitlement treats partial weeks as full weeks when calculating entitlement. Pro rata entitlement calculates funding entitlement according to the number of actual term days within a week. In the term holidays section, enter the start and finish dates for all the holidays that occur within the term period. For the dates you select, any children marked as term time only won't be eligible for funding. Choose a colour for this term. This is the colour it will appear as on the calendar. In this field, select which months this term runs through. Here, you can insert the under 2, 2-year, and 3-year funding rates for your local authority and for your invoices. You should note that funding rates as they apply to invoices only work if you set funding allocation to as per funding rates, while the local authority rates are what are used with the income forecast report. Underneath, you're able to set up the funding rates for early years pupil premium and deprivation supplements for 4 different bands. These can also be assigned to individual children when setting up the term on their profile. Click Save to create the term, or Save and Allocate to immediately bulk allocate this term to children. This is the bulk allocation screen. Using the fields next to a child's name, you can edit the allocation settings. Check these options to indicate if the child receives stretched funding or receives extra funding from the early years pupil premium. If this child receives a deprivation supplement, choose which band from this menu. Check this option to indicate that the parent has submitted the declaration form to be eligible for funding. As I mentioned earlier, you are able to set up your nursery funding settings so that it's required for children to have this option ticked before funding will be deducted from their invoice. Insert the universal entitlement and extended entitlement for the child into these fields. Use these buttons to switch between allocating funding hours per week or per term. If you want to use the same allocation settings for multiple children, click on the boxes next to their names to select them, then click Allocate. Fill out the details in the pop-up window, then click Allocate. If you'd like to copy funding allocation over from a previous term, select the children you want and click Copy. You can choose which term to copy over from this menu. If the child receives 2-year funding, you can choose the type from this menu. Once you're satisfied with how funding has been allocated for this term, click Save. To allocate a term to a child individually, go to the child's profile and click on the Funding tab. The individual funding settings you see on this screen are for changing funding allocation for specific children. By default, this will be set to the funding allocation settings you chose in System Settings. To allocate a term, click on the plus icon. Select a year from this menu, which will bring up a list of terms within that year. Choose the one you want. This will automatically fill in the start and finish dates for this term. Check these options to indicate that the child receives stretched funding or receives extra funding from the Early Years Pupil Premium. If this child receives a deprivation supplement, choose which band from this menu. Check this option to indicate that the parent has submitted the declaration form to be eligible for funding. Next, select whether you're allocating funding hours per week or per term. Then insert the funding entitlement for this child into the relevant fields. The funding hours for the other options will be automatically calculated based on this data. Once you're satisfied, click Save. You can find a summary of how funding entitlement for this term is allocated by clicking on this icon. At the top, you can see this child's total funding entitlement for the term, as well as the number of hours used. Below is a week-by-week breakdown of funding hours provided. Click on any of these fields to edit them. When you're done, click Update Funding. I hope that's helped you understand how to go about creating and assigning funding terms to children. For more videos and articles on the features of eymanage, take a look at our Help Centre.